working on getting one of our guests lined up here, Lieutenant Stephen Rogers, set to join us momentarily. But first, I am pleased to welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads from the Minneapolis area in Minnesota, Roshini Rajkumar, good friend of the show, of course, strategic communication and crisis coach to C-suite executives. She hosts Real Talk with Roshini on WCCO Radio in Minnesota and the Real Leaders with Roshini podcast. She is a licensed attorney and former TV reporter, author of the book Communicate That, her website, ownyourwow.com. Roshini Rajkumar joins us today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Roshini, welcome back to the program. It's good to have you.
Thanks, Jimmy. It's definitely a real heavy and hard day in Minneapolis. This is where I live, and the people of Minneapolis, the people of Minnesota, are saddened by what we're seeing and what's really being revealed to all of your eyes across the nation and the globe. It's definitely a tragic time right now.
Let me ask you for your perception of what happened. I mean, it doesn't seem to be too difficult to tell. Of course, we need the legal process to ferret out. But his life, George Floyd's life, was extinguished with a knee on his neck by a police officer. That's clear.
Yes, it really does look that way. Now, again, as someone who is a licensed attorney, I do like the process to play itself out. We still have some more video to look at. We have the body cams from those officers to look at, so we can see hopefully a little more what the reality check on what was actually happening at the moment of contact, that initial contact with George Floyd that would eventually lead to handcuffs and him on the ground and that terrible image of the knee on his neck. So right now, that is what we're also waiting for. But as that is happening, the protests, which some started as silent protests, have turned into loud protests, have turned into riots, have turned into fires, not far from where I actually live, maybe a few miles at the most, is where those fire scenes you've seen, buildings burned down, auto shop burned down, many businesses that are already hurting during this pandemic are now gone and definitely out of business. And that community, the people in that nearby area, having to live with the noise overnight of the riots and the continuing noise. But this is what we don't want to see. I mean, this is truly a crisis for our city. And we're hearing from different leaders, and I'm sure you'll want to get into some of those reactions. But that's just my initial reaction. And it's actually been very difficult to come up with words, Jimmy. There's a lot of sadness for all of us here, really.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly is a horrific circumstance, top to bottom. And the thing about these riots, though, is I'm not so sure that we can just say it's because of what happened to George Floyd, because you also have a couple of different dynamics at play, which is one, people are taking advantage of this situation. I mean, there's no excuse, no justification, no reason for this type of outright vandalism and destruction and theft of property. But also, we do have the reality of the shutdowns. People have been cooped up in their homes for months. And I can imagine that some of us are not too surprised from the standpoint of civil unrest being something we were fearing. And I know I was fearing that civil unrest might be something that would happen.
Exactly. Civil unrest was probably going to happen regardless of this tragedy going on. But those images you've seen of the Target being looted and people just visibly, very, very intentionally going in and stealing items. So these crimes that are happening in and around what started as more of a peaceful protest, that isn't the right reaction to the death of George Floyd.
Oh, by far. I mean, you're destroying property, you're stealing property if you are participating in a riot like that. That's for darn sure. All right, I'm very pleased to be joined as well, in addition to Roshini Rajkumar on the ground in Minneapolis, by Lieutenant Stephen Rogers, who served in the United States Air Force, who's in the Navy Reserve, who is also someone who for about 30 years or so was in the police force in Nutley, New Jersey, retired as a lieutenant. And Lieutenant Rogers, it's good to have you on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Welcome to the show, along with Roshini Rajkumar, myself, Jimmy Sengenberger.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. So I want to get your initial reaction, please, sir, to, first of all, the extinguishing of life, to put it mildly, of George Floyd, especially from your decades as a police officer and detective. What do you make of it?
The damage that these police officers created is far-reaching, well beyond the borders of that city. These officers drained the lifeblood out of positive police-community relations that was built over many decades across this country. And I've got to tell you, Jimmy, what troubles me is that the other officers on the scene did absolutely nothing to stop this individual officer who had his knee on this man's neck while the man is pleading for his life. And unfortunately, and I'm sorry to say this, there's a blue wall of culture in police departments that must be torn down by the officers themselves. So they weren't there to protect and serve. They killed and they stained the profession. And it's something that is having far-reaching repercussions across the country. This is an unspeakable tragedy.
And Lieutenant Rogers, when you look at this, as I agree, an unspeakable tragedy, and I think that's well said, what do you make of the investigation that's underway, and do you think that it's being handled well in the community there? It seems to be, and then we'll get Roshini's thoughts as a Minneapolis resident, but what are your thoughts from a distance as an officer?
What I'm pleased about is that President Trump had immediately directed the DOJ to immediately begin a federal investigation. I haven't seen that in many cases throughout my career. So the DOJ is involved. We have obviously local police and state police involved. But Jimmy, the importance of the federal government of being involved is that there is now a breakdown in trust between local police and the people. But the DOJ usually focuses in on every fine thing involving these investigations. So I'm happy to see the word immediate. That is absolutely imperative.
Let's look to a couple of days ago. The mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, had these words to say, and then we'll get Roshini's reaction.
We've seen black men die at the hands of law enforcement, or more recently, not law enforcement, for no reason. There will be an investigation conducted into the civil rights violations by the FBI, and I think that was absolutely the right call.
Roshini Rajkumar, what do you make of how the mayor of Minneapolis and other officials are handling this right now?
Well, it's a really good question, because that's a clip where I think we can agree what Mayor Frey is saying. We can all agree with that. He's also been very vocal about bringing in the race card in this and that angle. And for someone who's in his role as a mayor, he has shown a lot of emotion, and that may not play out well for the city. Coming into this, the city already had some community and policing issues. And I think they were making some headway, but there were definitely some big gaps. So when a tragedy like this happens, it only splinters that more. And the mayor has been very much on the side of George Floyd, which he should be. But usually the police also look, and Lieutenant Rogers can address this better than I, but usually the police would look to their mayor to support them, make sure justice is done, get questions asked. He's pretty much already put that main police officer whose knee was on George Floyd's neck behind bars. He's already done it. And myself, as a licensed attorney, I don't like to hear that kind of language coming from a mayor until charges are filed, until more of the process is played out, even though, look, the emotions and what we're watching all really do point in that direction. But we need to see more of the process played out. Our Attorney General for the state of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, has, by contrast, been a little calmer in his press conferences and is calling for the justice system to do its job. So I, like Lieutenant Rogers, am also very happy the feds are involved. The FBI, with our own Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, are overseeing this investigation. And that's the way to go, because it has to be taken out of the hands of the Minneapolis police.
We're joined by Roshini Rajkumar in Minneapolis, as well as Lieutenant Stephen Rogers. And Lieutenant Rogers, let me ask you, in terms of the handling of an investigation of officers who've committed an atrocity like this, how is that handled, and what should we be looking for as things play out from the investigation standpoint, sir?
Well, the police are certainly going to be looking at all of the video footage. That's something that is imperative with regard to this investigation. Now, that video footage is, I've got to tell you, I've heard reports that he resisted. Let's say he resisted. It still is no excuse to doing what they did, because the video reveals at the time that the officer put his knee on this guy's neck, he wasn't resisting. But that's the importance of video footage that years ago people didn't have when they ran into incidents like this. Witnesses are going to be very important. Who saw what and when, what happened prior to. But the fact of the matter is that with regard to the mayor's statements, and I'm glad the other guest on mentioned the Attorney General, who was very measured, these politicians have to be careful what they say, because they could prejudice a case. Regardless of what we've seen, there's a process, and the process must be followed. But I would say, Jimmy, more importantly, at least to me as a law enforcement professional, is for the police officers themselves, perhaps even the union, to come out and say, look, we don't condone this type of behavior. This is not indicative of what police officers do during the normal course of their duty. 99% of the cops across this country are heroes. They're good people. The men and women who wear that uniform truly protect and serve. Absolutely. Unfortunately, something like this kind of erases all of what they do on a daily basis. So that's the importance of not only mayors and politicians to come out, but police officers themselves to come out and say, look, these are things that are unacceptable. We don't condone it.
Roshini Rajkumar, one thing that I find interesting about this particular situation is that in the past, when we've seen Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, even Freddie Gray, circumstances where unarmed black men have been killed by police officers, the way in which it was handled was a lot more divided in terms of the coverage of it, in terms of commentary. With this one, everybody seems to be equally outraged about this, and to believe that not only there needs to be an investigation, but also deeply believe that there needs to be consequences. What do you make of what might be different about this particular circumstance compared to some of the past incidents we've seen?
Well, optics really win out, and often the first images rule the day. And in this situation, the first images really were that piece of video was out there, that several minutes, whether you watched the whole thing on Facebook or you saw parts of it on different newscasts, that was the damning video. And it was terrible. And no one who's a human being could look at that video and think there's anything right about it. Well, no matter what other angles of cameras got anything else going on that evening, that video is what we all saw first and what we all made our initial judgments on. So that's why it is important for leaders to stay reasoned at this time. There are some people in Minneapolis that are a little concerned if Mayor Frey does continue to be as antagonistic toward the police at this point, it will continue to cause more violence. And there are some who believe that is partly what may have led to some of the violence we've already seen. So that is why I'm just such a strong believer in calm. The more powerful you are on the outside starts with the calmer you are on the inside. And so the leaders who can bring us through this at all levels, both government as well as law enforcement, are going to be the ones that remember, we have a Constitution. It applies to everyone. Whether you are innocent or guilty, the Constitution applies to you.
Well said. Lieutenant Stephen Rogers, I would like you to give some comment on that as well, but also I want to play this surveillance footage that was also released yesterday, and it shows, to your point, and we've got it up here, to your point about not resisting arrest. I mean, if you look at the surveillance footage, what we see here, it doesn't really seem like there is a resistance going on that fits with any claims that there was some sort of a resisting of arrest. What do you make of that footage, as well as what I was saying before about the fact that we seem to have a united front in terms of our view on this, as opposed to some of the past instances?
Well, look, a picture's worth more than 1,000 words. These police officers knew full well that they were responding to what crime? A forged check? Nothing about weapons, nothing about resisting, nothing about a violent, possible violent confrontation, although you're always prepared for those things. But this fella, in no way, shape, or form, was resisting as far as we know. And I believe that he never resisted. But saying that, to the point of the other guests with regard to the comments of the mayor and others, it would best serve the community if the mayor got up there and said, look, he's going to gather with community leaders. He's going to sit them down with the police chief, and they're going to do everything they could to calm the nerves of a lot of people. This is how it works. This is what true leadership is, to calm everyone, not to come up with judgments before there's a process that is to be followed. So that would serve the best interests of the people. And secondly, what is very important is that they got a big job ahead of them now in Minneapolis and now around the country, because whether that was a white man or a black man, I've got to tell you, Jimmy, you said it all, the outrage across the board, no matter what color you are, no matter what ethnicity you are, the outrage across the board is actually bigger than I've ever seen. But also remember this. This is on the heels of what happened, last week? There was a young black man shot in another state because he was running down the street. I mean, you know what? There's something wrong somewhere when people feel that they could just, whether a victim is black or white, that police officers or anyone has the authority to just get up and take these severe actions. So my point is that the police are going to absolutely mention in their investigation rules and regulations weren't followed, use of force was too extensive, and on and on and on. But at the end of the day, who do you trust? And I still ask people, trust your cops, trust your police, and work together to rebuild that trust.
You know, to that point, from Lieutenant Rogers, Roshini Rajkumar, from the communication standpoint, which is one of your signature areas of expertise, how do you think we need to have politicians in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, and across the country help to bring that calm and soothe the nation and soothe the communities, but also to make sure that we're getting the right messages across to what Lieutenant Rogers was saying?
I definitely agree with Lieutenant Rogers that trust is a big thing, and there's been such a breakdown of trust even prior to this incident. So first and foremost, these leaders need to listen to all of the parties. You know, listening is one of those arts of communication that is very neglected, but this is very important right now, the listening. Also, not pointing fingers. I mean, the video unfortunately really does say it all, that life is not going to be good for that officer as well as his 3 colleagues. So that's a long road ahead for those 4 officers. I hope that the community around Minneapolis, the state, and the country don't continue to add fuel to the fire. You've probably seen a lot of the different kinds of remarks on Twitter and other social platforms. At this point, we need to wait. We need to see what happens by way of the justice system. We need to let the county attorney in Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis sits, do its job. We need to let the feds do their job and see what happens coming out of those things. And listening to one another is the first step in that. So this investigation will go on. We may see some other video. The different law enforcement and public figures have to do their work. But it's also happening in real time in a society that is bogged down in a global pandemic. Right. So we have to also remember, leaders have to also remember that it is like the worst kind of crisis within a crisis. They have to go above and beyond themselves to call for calm among their constituents. And to that end, I would give the Minneapolis police chief some credit. You haven't shown video of him yet today, but he has, for the most part, and he does have a pretty calm way about him, he has remained fairly calm, and he is the one who fired those 4 officers in pretty swift order. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for anyone who's speaking to the media, anyone involved in this case, to listen and to remain calm. And that is the only way we can go forward. And throwing names and throwing accusations will get us nowhere.
I think that is very well said. So final question for you both. I want to put up footage again, we played it before, of the riots happening on the streets in Minneapolis, and go to Roshini first since you're on the ground there, and then to Lieutenant Rogers. What do you make of this, and what can elected officials say to help try to get people to stop this kind of vandalism and violence and chaos that is now destroying businesses and lives in ways that are going to leave a lasting mark? Roshini.
Jimmy, my heart just hurts when I see this video and have been watching this video since yesterday, and it's only getting worse. These elected officials need to call to their constituencies. They need to bring together other influencers they have in these various communities, both communities of color as well as white communities, no matter where they are. All elected officials right now need to reach out to their constituencies and beg for conversation. Let your constituents know you are listening and you are ready to listen, but also challenge them that if they are going to protest, to do it peacefully and to not bring violence into the equation, because violence is only begetting more harm and it's causing far more victims.
Yeah. Lieutenant Stephen Rogers, your thoughts on what we're seeing on the streets in Minneapolis amidst I call it a crisis of credibility, where nobody seems to be trusting anybody in terms of authority or media or wherever else.
Jimmy, how adults handle a crisis has profound impact on our children and our grandchildren. And we need to keep that in mind as parents, as grandparents, and make sure that our children are not exposed to what we are seeing here. But more importantly, to the point of trust, I've learned in my police career that the people you could really trust, and there's really no credibility gaps with this group I'm about to share with you, can work well with the police to calm communities. And that is the clergy. That is the people in the churches and the synagogues and the mosque and in the temples. They're the ones who speak to more people during their church services or their worship services than any politician or police officer could talk to. So my recommendation would be, you want to calm nerves, the community leaders are those that we can see every day when you open up the doors of their houses of worship. So I would recommend to the police that they get together with those individuals in those houses of worship and then reach out, because those ushers and those men and women who work with these houses of worship, you know where they live? In the neighborhoods that are most affected by the violence. And they want help, they need help. Time for everyone to step up and to come together as partners.
Roshini Rajkumar, live in Minneapolis, and Lieutenant Stephen Rogers, formerly of the Nutley, New Jersey Police Department for about 30 years. Thank you both so much for sharing your insights today. Roshini, our hearts go out to your community. Thoughts and prayers and well wishes for a recovery from all of this. Best of luck to you, and thank you both so much for joining us today. Great conversation.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you. Once again, Roshini Rajkumar and Lieutenant Stephen Rogers joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. I think the very measured, very well-reasoned points. Really enjoyed that conversation. I hope you found it as insightful as I did. Urging calm. I got a little fired up in that first segment. We need to have calm. We need the process to play out, but they do need to be prosecuted, these officers, to the fullest extent of the law. Thanks for watching this clip of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel. You do not want to miss our live show. Thanks for your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.